Like others of my generation, I am devoted to food, money, and sex, but I have an ulcer and have been unhappily married to Lois Ann, a lawyer, for 12 years. As you might guess, we are both fearful of aging. Recently, Lois Ann showed me an article she had clipped from a newspaper, a profile of a well-known television actress who was described as being deep in her 30s. That's what we are, Lois Ann said sadly, deep in our 30s. She looked at me from behind a lens of tears. Despite our incompatibility, the two of us understand each other, and I knew more or less what it was she was thinking. Some years ago, when she was 25, she made up her mind to go to Vancouver Island and raise dahlias, but on the very day she bought her air ticket, she got a letter in the mail saying she'd been accepted at law school. "None of us writes our own script," she said to me once, and of course she's right. I still toy, I confess this to you freely, with my old fantasy of running a dude ranch, with the thought of well-rubbed saddles and harnesses and the whole sweet leathery tip of possibility, even though I know the dude market's been depressed for a decade, dead, in fact. Not long ago, on a Saturday morning, Lois Ann and I had one of our long talks about values, about goals. The mood as we sat over breakfast was sternly analytical. "Maybe we become trapped in a cult of consumerism and youth worship," I suggested. "Trapped by our zeitgeist," said Lois Ann, who has a way of capping a point, especially my point. A long silence followed, 20 seconds, 30 seconds. I glanced up from an emptied coffee cup, remembered that my 40th birthday was only weeks away, and felt a flare of panic in my upper colon. The pain was hideous and familiar. I took a deep breath as I'd been told to do. Breathe in, then out. Repeat. The trick is to visualize the pain, its substance and color, and then transfer it to a point outside the body. I concentrated on a small spot above our breakfast table, a random patch on the white wall. Often this does the trick, but this morning the blank space, the smooth drywall expanse of it, seemed distinctly accusing. At one time, Lois Ann and I had talked about wallpapering the kitchen, or at least putting up an electric clock shaped like a sunflower. We also considered a ceramic bas-relief of cauliflowers and carrots, and after that a little heart-shaped mirror bordered with rattan, and more recently a primitive map of the world with a practical acrylic surface. We have never been able to agree, never been able to arrive at a decision. I felt Lois Ann watching me, her eyes as neat and neutral as birds' eggs. "What we need," I said, gesturing at the void, "is a picture." "Or possibly a print," said Lois Ann, and immediately went to get her coat. 3 hours later, we were the owners of a cheerful lithograph titled The Orange Fish. It was unframed, but enclosed in a sandwich of twinkling glass, its corners secured by a set of neat metal clips. The mat surrounding the picture was a generous 3 inches in width. We liked that, and the background was a shimmer of green. Within this space, the orange fish was suspended. I wish somehow you might see this fish. He is boldly drawn and just as boldly colored. He occupies approximately 80% of the surface and has about him a wet, dense look of health. To me, at least, he appears to have stopped moving, to be resting against the wall of green water. A stream of bubbles, each one separate and tear-shaped, floats above him, binding him to his element. Of course, he is seen in side profile, as fish always are, and this classic posture underlines the tranquility of the whole. He possesses, too, a Buddha-like sense of being in the right place, the only place. His center, that is, where you might imagine his heart to be, is sweetly orange in color, and this color diminishes slightly as it flows toward the semi-transparency of fins and the round, ridged, non-appraising mouth. But it was his eye I most appreciated. The kind of wide, ungreedy eye I would like to be able to turn on to the world. We made up our minds quickly. He would fit nicely over the breakfast table. Lois Ann mentioned that the orange tones would pick up on the colors of the seat covers. We were in a state of rare agreement, and the price was right. Forgive me if I seem condescending, but you should know that, strictly speaking, a lithograph is not an original work of art, but rather a print from an original plate. The number of prints is limited to 10 or 20 or 50 or more, and this number is always indicated on the piece itself. A tiny inked set of numbers in the corner, just beneath the artist's signature, will tell you, for example, that our particular fish is number 8 out of an existing 10 copies, and I think it pleased me from the start to think of those other copies, the 9 brother fish scattered elsewhere, suspended in identical seas of green water, each pointed soberly in the same leftward direction. I found myself in a fanciful mood, humming, installing a hook on the kitchen wall, and hanging our new acquisition. We stepped back to admire it, and later Lois Ann made a Spanish omelette with fresh fennel, which we ate beneath the austere eye of our beautiful fish. As you well know, there are certain necessary tasks that coarsen the quality of everyday life, and while Lois Ann and I went about ours, we felt calmed by the heft of our solemn, gleaming fish. My health improved from the first day, and before long Lois Ann and I were on better terms, often sharing workaday anecdotes or pointing out curious items to each other in the newspaper. I rediscovered the girlish angularity of her arms and shoulders as she wriggled in and out of her little nylon nightgowns, smoothing down the skirts with a sly, sweet glance in my direction. For the first time in years, she left the lamp burning on the bedside table, and, as in our early days, she covered me with kisses, a long nibbling trail up and down the ridge of my vertebrae. In the morning, drinking our coffee at the breakfast table, we looked up, regarded our orange fish, smiled at each other, but were ritualistically careful to say nothing. We didn't ask ourselves, for instance, what kind of fish this was, whether it was a carp or a flounder or a monstrously out-of-scale goldfish. Its biological classification, its authenticity, seemed splendidly irrelevant. Details, just details. We swept them aside. What mattered was the prismatic disjection of green light that surrounded it. What mattered was that it existed, that it had no age, no history. It simply was. You can understand that to speculate, to analyze overmuch, interferes with that narrow gap between symbol and reality, and it was precisely in the folds of that little gap that Lois Ann and I found our temporary refuge. Soon an envelope arrived in the mail, an official notice. We were advised that the 10 owners of the orange fish met on the 3rd Thursday evening of each month. The announcement was photocopied, but on decent paper with an appropriate logo. 8:30 was the regular time, and there was a good-natured reminder at the bottom of the page about the importance of getting things going punctually. Nevertheless, we were late. At the last minute, Lois Ann discovered a run in her pantyhose and had to change. I had difficulty getting the car started, and, of course, traffic was heavy. Furthermore, the meeting was in a part of the city that was unfamiliar to us. Lois Ann, although a clever lawyer, has a poor sense of spatial orientation, and told me to turn left when I should have turned right. And there was the usual problem with parking, for which she seemed to hold me responsible. We arrived at 8:45, rather agitated and out of breath from climbing the stairs. Seeing that roomful of faces, I at first experienced a shriek in the region of my upper colon. Lois Ann had a similar shock of alarm, what she afterward described to me as a jolt to her imagination, as though an axle in her left brain had suddenly seized. Someone was speaking as we entered the room. I recognized the monotone of the born chairman.
"It is always a pleasure,"
the voice intoned,
"to come together, to express our concerns and compare experiences."
At that moment, the only experience I cared about was the sinuous river of kisses down my shoulders and backbone, but I managed to sit straight on my folding chair and to look alert and responsible. Lois Ann, in lawyer-like fashion, inspected the agenda, running a little gold pencil down the line of items, her tongue right between her teeth. The voice rumbled on. Minutes from the previous meeting were read and approved. There was no old business, nor any new business.
"Well then,"
the chairman said,
"who would like to speak first?"
Someone at the front of the room rose and gave his name, a name that conveyed the double-pillared boom of money and power. I craned my neck, but could only see a bush of fine white hair. The voice was feeble yet dignified, a persisting quaver from a soft old silvery throat, and I realized after a minute or two that we were listening to a testimonial. A mystical experience was being described. Something, too, about the search for definitions, and about wandering in the wilderness, and about the historic symbol of the fish in the Western tradition, a secret sign, an icon expressing providence.
"My life has been altered," the voice concluded, "and given direction."
The next speaker was young, not more than 20, I would say. Lois Ann and I took in the flare of dyed hair, curiously angled and distinctively punk in style. You can imagine our surprise. Here of all places to find a spiked bracelet, black nails, cheeks outlined in blue paint, and a forehead tattooed with the world's most familiar expletive. The orange fish had been a graduation gift from his parents. The framing alone cost $200. He had stared at it for weeks, or possibly months, trying to understand what it meant. Then revelation rushed in. Fishness was a viable alternative. The orange fins and sneering mouth said no to all that garbage that gets shoveled on your head by society. So keep swimming and don't take any junk, he wound up, then sat down to loud applause. A woman in a neatly tailored mauve suit spoke for a quarter of an hour about her investment difficulties. She'd tried stocks, she'd tried the bond market, she'd tried treasury bills and mutual funds. In every instance, she found herself buying at the peak and selling just as the market bottomed out. Until she found out about investing in art. Until she found the orange fish. She was sure now that she was on an upward curve, that success was just ahead. Recently, she had started to be happy, she said. A man rose to his feet. He was in his mid-50s, we guessed, with good teeth and an aura of culture lightly worn. "Let me begin at the beginning," he said. He had been through a period of professional burnout, arriving every day at his office exhausted. "Try to find some way to brighten up the place," he told his secretary, handing her a blank check. The orange fish appeared the next day. Its effect had been instantaneous, on himself, his staff, and also on his clients. It was as though a bright banner had been raised. Orange, after all, was the color of celebration, and it is the act of celebration that has been crowded out of contemporary life. The next speaker was cheered the moment he stood. He had, we discovered, traveled all the way from Japan, from the city of Kobe, making our little journey across the city seem trivial. As you can imagine, his accent was somewhat harsh and halting, but I believe we understood something of what he said. In the small house where he lives, he has hung the orange fish in the traditional tokonoma alcove, just above the black lacquered slab of wood on which rests a bowl of white flowers. The contrast between the sharp orange of the fish's scales and the unearthly whiteness of the flower's petals reminds him daily of the contradictions that abound in the industrialized world. At this, no one clapped louder than myself. "A fish is devoid of irony," someone else contributed in a brisk, cozy voice, and is therefore a reminder of our lost innocence, of the era that predated double meanings and trial balloons. But, at the same time, a fish is more and also less than its bodily weight. A slim, dark-haired woman, hardly more than a girl, spoke for several minutes about the universality of fish, how 3/4 of the earth's surface is covered with water, and in this water leap fish by the millions. "There are people in this world," she said, "who have never seen a sheep or a cow, but there is no one who is not acquainted with the organic shape of the fish."
"We begin our life in the water,"
came a hoarse and boozy squawk from the back row.
"and we yearn all our days to return to our natural element. In water, we are free to move without effort, to be most truly ourselves."
"The interior life of the fish is unknowable," said the next speaker, who was Lois Ann. "She swims continuously and is as mute, as voiceless as a dahlia. She speaks at the level of gesture, encircling patterns revived and repeated. The purpose of her eye is to decode and rearrange the wordless world." "The orange fish," said a voice which turned out to be my own, "will never grow old." I sat down. Later, my hand was most warmly shaken. During the refreshment hour, I was greeted with feeling and asked to sign the membership book. Lois Ann put her arms around me, publicly, her face shining, and I knew that when we got home she would offer me a cup of cocoa. She would leave the bedside lamp burning and bejewel me with a stream of kisses. You can understand my feeling. Enchantment. Ecstasy. But waking up in the morning, we would not be the same people. I believe we all felt it, standing in that brightly lit room with our coffee cups and cookies. The woman in the tailored mauve suit, the 50-ish man with the good teeth, even the young boy with his crown of purple hair. We were, each of us, speeding along a trajectory away from each other and away from that one fixed point in time, the orange fish. But how helplessly distorted our perspective turned out to be. What none of us could have known that night was that we were the ones who were left behind, sheltered and reprieved by a rare congeniality and by the pleasure that each of us feels when our deepest concerns have been given form. That very evening, in another part of the city, 10,000 posters of the orange fish were rolling off a press. These posters, which would sell first for $10, then $8.49, and then later $1.95, would decorate the rumpled bedrooms of teenagers and the public washrooms of filling stations and beer halls. Within a year, a postage stamp would be issued, engraved with the image of the orange fish, but a fish whose eye, miniaturized, would hold a look of mild bewilderment. And sooner than any of us would believe possible, the orange fish would be slapped across the front of a Sears flyer, given a set of demeaning eyebrows, and cruelly bisected with an invitation to stock up early on back-to-school supplies. There can be no turning back at this point, as you surely know. Winking off lapel buttons and earrings, stamped onto sweatshirts and neckties, doodled on notepads and in the margin of love letters, the orange fish, without a backwards glance, will begin to die.